Welcome to No to NATO, No to War. The last rally we had online has been watched by well over 500,000 people, perhaps 600,000 people by the time you see this. The No to NATO, No to War organization is, first of all, worldwide. It is non-party, non-sectarian, and we are not required to agree with each other about anything else other than the need to stop the wars and to identify NATO as the primary war driver in the world today. There are no blood tests here. You are welcome to follow us, No to NATO, No to War, on our social media platforms, and indeed to get involved in any of the activities that we call around the country, around the world, as we are able to do so. We're going to focus, I'm sure, tonight on the crisis in the Middle East, the Israel-Palestine war. I want to, first of all, make clear that this is an Israel-Palestine war. Nobody should allow our enemies to frame this conflict as an Israel-Hamas war. Well over 1,000 Palestinians have been killed in the last 4 or 5 days, and most of them were women and children. By definition, not Hamas. Most of the people who live in the Gaza Strip are children. By definition, not Hamas. And when you're dealing death and destruction on an almost unimaginable scale, already more serious than the previous worst in 2014, you cannot possibly know who it is that you are killing. But then perhaps you don't want to know. And more particularly, you don't want others to know. But those of us with access to channels of information from the terrestrial, the satellite, and the social media sphere are well aware of who is doing the dying. The air is thick with propaganda canards about dead Israeli children. But 400 Palestinian children have already been killed. The world is thick with completely unsubstantiated claims of 40 Israeli children being murdered, but 400, 10 times as many, have entirely verifiably been slaughtered in the Gaza Strip. So that's my first warning to people. There's a deliberate attempt to conflate the Palestinian population in Gaza with Hamas. In fact, there are multiple political factions within the Palestinian arena, and there were many factions involved in the prison breakout that occurred on the 7th of October. On that occasion, people of all political stripes, seeing the possibility, as the great Israeli writer Gideon Levy put it, to tear down the bars of the cage in which they have been incarcerated for 75 years, since 1948, seeing those bars open, what do you expect other than the people to seek to escape, to taste freedom, even if only for a few hours, even if at the cost ultimately of their own lives? The second point I wish to make is that this is now a NATO war. Although Stoltenberg has just said that it is not a NATO war, all of the evidence is that it is. First of all, the weaponry that is slaughtering the innocents in Gaza all comes from the United States of America, gratis, and even with money attached to it. The United States sends an ocean of military and financial aid to Israel every year. And that's without counting the private benefaction, which goes on constantly in Hollywood, in the music industry, all over the United States. people are sending hundreds of millions of dollars to the Israeli state and its institutions, including the institutions which literally enforce apartheid. Apartheid Israel is so called because all of the world's major human rights organizations and some of Israel's leading human rights organizations and writers and commentators like Levy and others have charted undeniably. Ilan Pappé, the author of the biggest prison in the world about Gaza, have all charted detailed accounts of the apartheid system which is operated in Israel against the Palestinian people. Apartheid Israel is the recipient every year of a bonanza of American assistance. But in the last few days, other NATO countries have joined in. It's reported today that Britain is going to send warships to the shores of the Levant in the Mediterranean. For what purpose? What purpose are warships sent to a war zone? There they will join not one, but two of the United States' aircraft carriers. Israel is itself an American aircraft carrier, but they're sending two floating aircraft carriers. To do what? Asked President Putin. To frighten the people? The people in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria are no longer afraid of anything, least of all Joe Biden, whose dotage, whose cringe-worthy dotage was on display again just last night when he claimed to the world on stage that he had seen photographs, videos of Israeli children being beheaded, only to send his officers out to, in American parlance, walk that back in the minutes after he had stopped speaking. We saw no such pictures, no such videos, they said. We were told about them by that paragon of virtue and truth, Benjamin Netanyahu, whom just a couple of weeks ago, all of these same media outlets and liberal institutions were trying to overthrow as the Prime Minister of Israel, backing the demonstrations of millions of Israelis to bring him down. Now, his word can be relied upon. Well, not by most people in the world. It cannot. Imagine the irresponsibility of the President of the United States of America saying that he had seen pictures and videos that minutes later it had to be admitted he had not seen. In an atmosphere, a febrile atmosphere of pre-genocide, how reckless, how irresponsible was that performance by Joe Biden last night? Today, the French government of Emmanuel Macron banned all pro-Palestinian demonstrations throughout France and declared that anyone demonstrating in support of the Palestinians will be arrested in the way that we know in France people are arrested. In Britain, a young man was arrested for wearing a Palestinian flag around his shoulders. This is the alliance of democracy that NATO represents. The same thing happened in Germany, where a pro-Israel rally was allowed untrammeled to proceed, but a pro-Palestinian rally was brutally assaulted. The same thing is happening in Canada and in other NATO countries. So whatever Stoltenberg says, he had just had a meeting with other NATO defense chiefs and the head of the Israeli military, its Minister of Defense. If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, we say it is a duck. It is another NATO war. Now, I'm almost out of epithets. I can no longer fully put into words the suffering, the devastation that I am watching only on social media, of course, minute by minute, under the bombardment in Gaza. I have a lot of history in this matter. I repeatedly led convoys of aid into the besieged Gaza Strip during previous conflicts since 2008. Sometimes I see videos of myself and I don't know which particular war these videos were filmed during. A family of 44 was murdered this afternoon. That is 44. The Shahab family. I know them well as it happens. I've kissed their cheeks as it happens. All 44 members of one family, the Shahab family, remember their name, have just been murdered. And so I'm going to pass through the microphone to our excellent panel, as always, here on No to NATO, No to War, where we seek to rally people around the world against the never-ending wars into which NATO and the empire has plunged us. And there is none more eloquent than our first speaker this evening. Seyed Mohammad Marandi is a professor at the University of Tehran, a frequent guest of mine on the mother of all talk shows. And I hope that we can listen now to his answer to this question. Is this a NATO war, Professor? And where is it headed? Professor Marandi.
Yes, it is definitely a NATO war, just like the war in Ukraine was a NATO war. And I think it's leading Europe and the United States towards disaster. They simply cannot continue as in the past. They do not have the strength that they had after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They don't have the energy, the resources. The countries have powerful rivals that did not exist in the past, whether it's China, which rivals the United States, or BRICS countries that rival the G7 countries, and so on. So the more the United States continues down this road of violence and massacre and genocide, the worse it is going to get for Europeans. And I think people in the West, or at least elites in the West, underestimate how global public opinion has changed. This is not the world that we live in today, is not the world of, as I said, 20, 30 years ago. People don't necessarily get their news from CNN. They don't get their news necessarily from the BBC or the Times or the Guardian. They have alternative sources for information across Africa, across Latin America, across what many call the Middle East or West Asia, as I prefer, and across Asia. So the people are outraged by what the Israelis are doing. No matter how the Americans and the West tries to portray Israel as the victim, people aren't buying it. And I think actually last night, Biden, when he claimed to have seen footage or photos of beheaded children, he actually helped those who are opposed to the United States, because he had to retract. The White House had to point out that there is no such evidence, because ultimately, if he's seen such footage, then we have to see it too. And since it's not forthcoming, it's obvious that he was lying. And the reason why he was lying, and the reason why CNN is lying, and the reason why the media as a whole is lying, is because they need to justify the slaughter of Palestinians. I think the corporate media, state media in the West, EU, across the EU, across North America, Canada, the United States, what they're attempting to do is to prepare the public for a massacre. So they want to keep the public focused on their stories, false claims of rape, false claims of beheadings, and a host of other false claims that they made. And a final point is that the Palestinian resistance groups that broke the barriers and fled the prison, the open air prison of Gaza, they were basically going back to see the land of their parents. Their parents lived in those areas and they were ethnically cleansed and taken to Gaza. Gaza was a small town before the ethnic cleansing took place. And these people do not, most of them do not belong to Gaza. They actually belong to those areas which have been occupied by Israelis that have been brought in from Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and North America for the most part.
Professor, all eyes are on a potential widening of the war. I know you don't speak for, can't speak for, no one can speak for the Lebanese resistance, but it's widely reported that if a ground invasion of the Gaza Strip occurs, that the Lebanese resistance will enter the war. And if the Lebanese resistance were to enter the war, it would quickly spread. It would spread north to Syria, it would spread to Iraq, where very large numbers of people who are very well armed would undoubtedly respond to that new situation. And ultimately, of course, to the Islamic Republic of Iran, which may itself then become involved either by being attacked or by itself entering the war. What can you say about that hypothetical?
Well, George, in the past, and you know as well as I, when American naval forces would come into the Persian Gulf, that meant they were about to destroy a country. And we saw that in the war, in the two wars with Saddam Hussein. But that's not the case anymore. The world has changed. Iran is a much more powerful country than it was 20, 30 years ago. We've seen the claims made about Iranian weapons and Iranian drones. We know now that in Iraq, the Americans are very vulnerable. If there is violence against Hezbollah, or if there's an escalation in Gaza, then I think the Americans should expect to be expelled from Iraq, whether diplomats or the military or their businesses, they'll all be gone. And we have to also keep in mind Yemen, because Yemen today is not that Yemen of 2 years ago. They have built up their armed forces. They even, in their recent parade, they had a military plane from the past fly over the parading soldiers. They are much more capable now. Their drones and missiles are much more advanced and much more numerous than before. So if the Americans escalate, then they will be hit very hard. They will ultimately be expelled from the region. And if, for example, the United States or the British or the French do something foolish about Iran, well, those countries that have American bases or British bases or French bases in the Persian Gulf region, they will be seen as adversaries, and their infrastructure will be destroyed. So Qatar knows it has to be very careful about what the United States does on its territory. The same is true with the Emirates and Bahrain. So Iran wants very good relations with these countries. And as we saw last night, the phone conversation between Mohammed bin Salman, whatever we may think of him, and the Iranian president, I think shows that the region is moving closer to each other because public opinion is so outraged by what the United States and its allies are doing in Palestine. And leaders, whether they want to or not, they have to be seen as supporting the Palestinian people. So I don't think it's going to be easy for the Americans and their allies to escalate. My understanding is that these resistance groups, they have been discussing scenarios for quite a while, and they are prepared for each and every scenario. So every few hours, we get something in the Western media that the United States warned this group or that country about this. But the reality is that the US is very vulnerable at a time when the US and the EU are focused on Ukraine. We haven't been hearing anything about Ukraine for the last few days. We're now beginning to hear that the funding for Ukraine is going to decrease. And I think that is going to lead to the collapse of the Kiev government. And that is going to make things even worse for the Americans in Israel, because Israel's strength is due to its relationship with the United States and the EU. Israel itself is a small, vulnerable, weak country. It only has the power to fight because the West gives it that power to carry out genocide as we see right now.
Thanks for now, Professor. Let me introduce our second speaker. Tara Reade is an author, an activist, and a former US Senate staffer, where, amongst other things, she worked for the very same Joe Biden. Tara, thanks for joining No2Nato, No to War this evening. How do you locate this conflict in that wider sea of troubles that the United States faces?
Well, thank you so much for having me here. You know, I spoke with Rage Against the War Machine in the United States when I was able to be there. And for those in your audience that don't know, I now have had to seek political asylum in Russia, and the Russian Federation has given me that. So I am now in Moscow, Russia. I have been outspoken against the proxy war that the US and NATO has been fighting against Russia via Ukraine. I have talked about the corruption and the military-industrial complex that's being enriched. I agree with some of what the professor says, but some of it, I'm going to have to say that, you know, I've heard some of these people with their mics off and in the rooms, and I'm telling you, they are very dedicated to going to a world war. We are in a world war right now. And just yesterday, they gave $300 million more in weapons in Ukraine. Now, they're getting quieter about the money going to Ukraine because it's not politically popular. Everyone knows the statistics. Joe Biden's polling numbers are down 30%, which is the lowest in US history for a president. However, they're finding other ways to fund the Ukraine conflict. Well, I mean, the proxy war, actually, let's call it what it is. They're finding other ways by using grants from the Defense Department. And so we're looking at billions of dollars that's still being pumped into this money laundering scheme. And some of those weapons are ending up all over the place, as the UN Security Council, Russian Federation, did try to have a meeting about and pointed out. Interpol even putting out a warning about the amount of weapons that were being sold on the black market. What I really see is you have now, you mentioned it earlier in your speech, George, that there are ships now from the US now in the region, and they're now closer to the conflict everywhere, and those have fighter jets. Now, if fighter jets enter into this in any way, shape, or form, we are looking at a world conflict. And we're at a really dangerous precipice. And I think Scott Ritter has eloquently spoken about this. We are closer to nuclear war than we ever have been because of the Biden regime and the people behind the scenes. The people's names that you don't always see in front of the cameras, right? The people behind the politicians. And you know this well, George, you spoke out against the Iraq war eloquently. You spoke to some of the same people I knew that are still there and still profiting from war. All you have to do is look at the US stocks and the weapons manufacturing stock that went up through the roof yesterday in the last 48 hours. They're not weakened, they're making money, and they're going to use weapons, and they're going to make more weapons. And that's the tragedy of all of this. And who's suffering, as you mentioned, are the women and children. There's 1 million children in the Gaza Strip. They are not related to Hamas, you're right. And this is a horrific thing that the US is doing. They're posing their support of Israel in an effort to get domination in the region. They want access to those gas things that are right off the coast of the Gaza Strip. They're wanting access. They're wanting a hot war, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, but I think they're trying to stoke the flames to get a hot war with Iran and open another front. And I don't know all of the details of why, but I do know that that's what I've been hearing. Whether this will happen or not remains to be seen, but there's definitely been no dialogue about peace. And that's what we really need. So I think to the point of NATO, it's unclear where America starts and ends with NATO. It's all one. They're like one big blob of military warmongering.
Yes, it's straight out of Orwell's 1984, actually. The national boundaries, sovereignty, and so on have all been erased, subsumed. As a matter of fact, the United States doesn't seem to have any borders at the moment. And certainly the European countries are now indistinguishable from the United States. They are worse than satraps. They are worse than vassals. They are servile to the demands of the least impressive emperor ever to emerge on the world stage, the same Joe Biden. Let me ask you, though, as an American, albeit in exile, for a time during the Ukraine conflict, we had a bank of allies. Let's call them the American right, the conservatives, the America First, the MAGA types, with President Trump at the front, who so hated Joe Biden they were ready to side with us over the Ukraine war in order to harm and to reduce his effectiveness and popularity. They said they stood for America First, but it's become abundantly clear this week that that's not really true. They weren't prepared to put Ukraine first, but they sure as hell are prepared to put Israel first. How do you explain that?
Money. That's where their money is. That's where they're, you know, all of this is about energy money, and it's about weapons money and manufacturing. And, you know, Lindsey Graham, you know, he's not a MAGA, obviously. If there's never been a war that he doesn't, you know, really want. So you have him out there, you know, on the television and everywhere else on the internet trying to stoke up World War III. But the MAGA supporters, yes, have come down really hard on any kind of discussion about the suffering of the Palestinian people. And it's really heart-wrenching because, you know, if they really truly were against war crimes, then they would be talking about the 400 plus children in Palestine that are dead. They would talk about the open air prison. They would be talking about the suffering and no more money going to war, but going to the infrastructure of the United States, which is falling apart. It's an empire in crisis. There is no doubt. But yes, I think this is a good time to see all the true colors, right? Trump is not going to be the savior. And not just with this particular thing that's happening now, but George, but also with when you look at their opinions about China and Taiwan. You know, many Republicans and many MAGA are supportive of going to war with China, which is unreal, you know? So I think we have a problem in America culturally with everything being built around the military complex, industrial complex, which Eisenhower warned about. And this is all driven with the intelligence services that is now using NATO as a battering ram for the rest of the world. And here we are, we're at the brink. I think, in my lifetime, I've never seen us closer to nuclear war than we are in this moment. And what's really horrible about that, George, is how easy someone could make a mistake, how a false flag could trigger a world war. And that's why the information war and the, actual conventional war is merging and becoming one big monster right now.
One big monster. Thank you, Tara. Richard Medhurst is a broadcaster extraordinaire. He broadcasts even more than I do. And the quality as well as the quantity of his efforts have made him really quite significant media presence, notwithstanding his young years. Richard Medhurst, welcome to No2Nato. As Tara describes it there, it's a bleak prospect, at least for us in the West. In Britain, all of the political parties, a monolithic parliament, are wholeheartedly in support, not just of this assault on the people in Palestine, but on the Ukraine proxy war before it. In the United States, all of the political leaders, including Robert F. Kennedy Jr., are all mad for Israel, mad for war against the Palestinian people. I mean, if we lived in Britain or America, there's actually effectively nobody to vote for, nobody to support, because in a so-called democracy, everyone at the top is on one side. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you, George, for the kind introduction, and for everybody at No2Nato and the Workers' Party of Britain for their efforts. I think it's it's a really sad state of affairs, because you put it very eloquently. We're kind of we really don't have any choice at the buffet. It's either red or Tory war party, or we can have blue Labour war party, and they're both rabid, crazy Zionists, and I think it's I mean, if we had if all our parliamentarians were like you and Chris Williamson, I think we would be very sound and very okay. But unfortunately, it's not the case. And like Tara pointed out, it's funny because and so did you, George, that the Republicans or the right in America who were against the war in Ukraine just because they wanted to have something to oppose Joe Biden with, now they're suddenly totally fine with giving all this money again because it's Israel. And I think it's the same, sad state of affairs when you talk about China, or when you talk about the Indo-Pacific. Instead of using Israel, they will use Australia, and then use that as a lily pad to go and attack China or Palestine in this case. And I think it's very important for people to understand that this conflict, again, it's not between Hamas and Israel. It's between the Palestinian people, the Lebanese people, the Syrian people, and Israel, and it goes back a long time. And in post-war Britain, I don't know what changed since then, but in post-war Britain, the number one threat to the security services in England, it was the Stern Gang. It was the Zionist militias that now make up the Israeli military, and many of the terrorists who put bombs in the King David Hotel or in Jerusalem or in London, and were sending off letter bombs. They went on to become prime ministers, and they couldn't even visit the UK because they would have been arrested on terrorism charges for having killed so many British officers and so on. So I don't know what changed in the UK that we're not only okay with the Israelis, but we support them like some kind of hypnosis. And Suella Braverman, now the Home Secretary, she's saying that she wants to maybe ban Palestinian flags. And I saw someone being arrested. I think it was in Manchester for wearing a Palestinian flag, and they've put one up. You know, they've put them up actually on all government buildings. I was going to say in Sheffield, but then I remember they've put them up now on all government buildings. I don't know what this you know, can be described as, except war propaganda. It's just war propaganda. And the only reason that many prominent European leaders supported creating in Israel was because they were actually anti-Semites and wanted to get rid of Jews in Europe. So I find it ironic that now, if you are a Palestinian or, you know, Lebanese or Syrian, you want to resist Israeli or / European settlers taking your land, then that makes you an anti-Semite, but not the European leaders who wanted to get rid of Jews. You know, if Ursula von der Leyen is so convinced of what she's saying, perhaps the Germans or the French should have given the Israelis their land in form of reparations instead of, you know, taking it out on Palestine. And it's absolutely horrific. The family that, you know, 44 members of the same family killed today, and tomorrow there'll be another atrocity, and the day after, and it's bewildering that we cannot even keep track anymore. You know, it all becomes so blurry because you go think of a particular crime the Israelis have committed, and you can find them having done it 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 7 years ago. It's always the same, and I don't know how people allow this to continue. I really find it so ironic that we tell the Russians that they can't bomb the Ukrainians and cut off their water and cut off their electricity, but it's okay to cut off the water and electricity for Palestinians because they're not human beings apparently, and this is Israel defending itself. What is this phrase, Israel has the right to defend itself, except propaganda? You know, if that's them defending themselves, well, what do they look like when they're on the offensive then? The Palestinians are the ones who have the right to defend themselves, and the law is very clear about this. You know, that it's unequivocal when it comes to the UN Charter, when it comes to the Geneva Convention. The Israelis are an occupying power. The Palestinians have every right to resist. Whether they want to, you know, throw stones or throw rockets, it's their business. The UN General Assembly has made this clear that you can take up arms against an occupier, and you know, the right to national liberation. They mention all these words when it comes to Ukraine, and now when the Palestinians, who have a much stronger case for this because they're not fighting a proxy war, they're fighting an actual war it's an actual struggle of national liberation. You know, these things don't matter suddenly. And I think it's the reporters are also sickening, because the same people who will sit down on CNN and on the BBC and start talking about how tragic it is in Ukraine, they now don't want to show you that, you know, children can't turn on the taps in Gaza. And when they do show you some of the crimes the Israelis are committing, they always have to preface it by saying, well, Hamas terrorists attacked the Israelis. Oh, and by the way, here are some Israeli crimes. You know, like they just want to make sure the Israelis can't, you know, label them as anti-Semites or something. I think the fact that they even say terrorists about Hamas is very telling, because Israel and its behavior, you know, that fits the bill of actual terrorism. Whereas legally speaking, morally speaking, Hamas are not terrorists. They're a Palestinian resistance group, and they wouldn't even exist were it not for the Israelis. So if the Israelis are so concerned about them, they shouldn't have created the conditions and oppressed the Palestinians to the point that Hamas exists or Hezbollah exists. Yeah, again, these groups did not, you know, they had no place in Palestine. They did not exist in the 1940s or 50s, and yet Israel was right there committing the same crimes that it is committing today. So this has been a continuous policy of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, and the Israelis have no one to blame but themselves. And you know, it's funny watching them talk about you know, Israelis who have been hurt by this and that, and these people have 3-4 passports. They can go wherever the hell they like. Where are the Palestinians supposed to go? They're supposed to go up in a rocket. Do they have a space program we haven't heard about? And Netanyahu, no matter how many times he says that, oh, you should get out of Gaza, which is, as I said, it's physically impossible, that does not absolve him of his crimes. The Israelis, they should, if they really want peace, they should just go back to Eastern Europe, to Western Europe, to Australia, to Britain. It doesn't matter. But that is really the only way to fix what is happening, if they're even interested, which I doubt. But I always remind myself that the French kicked out, well, the Algerians kicked out 1.5 million Frenchmen, and they thought that Algeria was part of France, and they annexed it and they carved it up into 6 different départements, which is, you know, basically like counties in France. So, you know, there's always hope. I don't think the Palestinians should fret. And right now, we've never seen this kind of situation where you have Syria, Hezbollah, and Hamas all hitting Israel at the same time. We had it actually just once in April, but now this is much more serious because the Israelis are having to stretch themselves thin, and that's why they're going and running and trying to get you know, our ships and the Americans' ships to come to the you know, to come to the Mediterranean Sea and posture for them, because they are scared. That's why we saw so many of the Israelis running away. You know, the first thing they did is they took out their passports, their 3 passports, and started running to the airport. You know, they're not willing to actually fight for this land because it's not theirs. So they don't have the same attachment to it. Palestinians got no choice. Palestinian, it's this or bust. There is nothing else. There is no other option. And the Israelis who have weapons, who are encouraged by the government to get weapons, you know, the second things got serious, they fled like cowards. And that's the only thing they're really good at. It's coming with F-16s. That have been given to them by the Americans, and dropping bombs on you know, a besieged strip of beach that has no you know, no conventional armed forces, no anti-aircraft, and that's not to say that Hamas have not become you know, have not advanced themselves in military terms, because they certainly have, and they've proved that. But we are not talking, as Professor Marandi put it, we are not talking about the same Israel of 20 years ago, nor are we talking about the same Hamas or Lebanon or Iran or Syria of 20 years ago. The Israelis have tried everything. They claim they've tried everything to fight quote unquote terrorism, right? And if their policy was really to try and make the resistance weaker, well, they have utterly failed. The Israelis have become weaker, and it's the resistance that have grown stronger. And I don't think many people would have expected to see all these parties working together as one, and Yemen and the PMU in Iraq all saying we're ready to join the fight if it comes to that. You know, these and again, even among the Palestinian groups, PIJ and Hamas and the Lion's Den and so on, we never saw these groups working together in such a level. And so that shows you that the occupation has become unbearable, and it's always been unbearable, but it has surpassed, you know, levels of evil that I think none of us can even fathom, because we haven't lived there. Even though we're all aware of it and we talk about it, we cannot imagine what it's like for the Palestinians to live through that day in, day out. And so the fact that these groups are working together, it's not because they're good, you know, military planners, or it's not only down to that. It's because Israel is become so vicious in its policies that it has actually achieved the opposite and united all the people that it occupies. And that doesn't mean that they won't try and bomb Gaza and pummel it, because they are. But nothing can change what happened on October 7th. That was a very big, significant military victory. And, you know, everybody in Palestine, everybody in the Arab world, whether they like Hamas or they don't like Hamas, for them to see the Palestinians overcome the Israelis, this paper tiger, and actually break out of that prison, even if it's, you know, just for a few hours, as you mentioned, George, that was a victory, and the Israelis can never ever take that away.
Professor Marandi, Damascus and Aleppo airports were bombed today when the Iranian foreign minister was on his way to land in Syria. The Israelis openly concede that this was a preemptive move, a preemptive strike. But as a precursor to what? What do you think they might have in mind for Syria?
Well, they've been bombing Syrian airports regularly over the last few years. And of course, as you know, alongside the Golan, which they occupy illegally and which belongs to the Syrian people. During the dirty war in Syria, ISIS and Al-Qaeda they had bases, and the Israelis gave them weapons, they gave them ammunition, they gave assistance to their injured, and every now and then when the Syrian government would advance on against these troops, whether ISIS or Al-Qaeda, the Israelis would start firing artillery shells or rockets or tank fire at the Syrians to slow them down. So the Israelis have a history of aggression against Syria. Unfortunately, Mr. Erdogan in Turkey has the same dark past, especially since 2000, or particularly since 2011 and 12. But in any case, the Syrians, they have regained a large part of their sovereignty. The Americans still occupy a significant part of the country. The Turks, they occupied a significant other part of the country, and the Israeli regime continues to occupy the Golan. But Syria is much stronger today than it was before. And there's also, I think, something that we have to take note of, and that is that in this war in Ukraine, and I agree 100%, and I don't think any of us were actually surprised that the MAGA people and the Republicans, that they would side with Israel. I think it was clear that Israel is just something different for them than Ukraine. But the fact is that because of Ukraine, and because of other issues, the United States has forced countries to take sides. And that has created a gap between, for example, Russia and Israel. Not that the relations have fallen apart, but it's not like it was before. Or the Chinese, for example, because the Israelis do not have the room for maneuver that they used to have when dealing with China, they too have moved away from Israel a bit. So the Americans, by creating this new Cold War, they're actually weakening the Israeli regime, because the Israeli regime had this special privilege of being able to work with the Russians and the Chinese and everyone, and the Americans would look away, even when selling advanced technology. And they were told that the routes to the heart of Washington goes through Tel Aviv, and that's what Arab countries in the region were told. So you have that space that has been created on the one hand, and also in the region. I think that as the United States declines, countries in the region are going to be thinking differently about their future, and they already are. The phone conversation between President Raisi and Mohammed bin Salman, I think, is very symbolic, and it shows that Saudi Arabia needs to be seen as opposing the United States. And I think that is something that is different from the past. In the past wars, the Saudis were always attacking Hezbollah and blaming Hezbollah and Hamas and Islamic Jihad for being troublemakers. But this is not what they're doing this time around. So this is a major change. I agree with everything that Tara and Richard said. But what I would like to add is that I think that, as I said earlier, as the United States declines, as its allies decline, the fortunes of the Israeli regime declines. And we are witnessing a new era of war as well, this asymmetrical warfare that I think to a large degree comes from Iran, and the Russians learned from it, and so did groups in southern Lebanon and Palestine. This is a very cheap way to fight a very expensive army, and it's a very effective way. The Israelis, their advantage has always been their air force, but Hezbollah is underground. Hamas and Islamic Jihad are underground. The assets, the military assets of Islamic Jihad and in particular Hamas, have been left untouched because they're very deep underground and very well protected. And under Gaza, you have tunnels everywhere. So if the Israeli regime wants to enter the city, it's going to be much more than a bloody nose. I don't believe that the Israeli regime can take Gaza. And I don't think that the resistance front will allow them to take Gaza anyway. And I don't think that the West, although powerful, as Tara pointed out, although dangerous, although fanatical, these elites, but I think that they don't have the power to control events that they did before. And the defeat that we've seen over the past 5 days, the fact that Hamas is still in the areas around Gaza, we've been hearing in the Western media that the Israelis took back all their positions, but the reality is quite different. Hamas is still positioned in these territories, which, as I said, these were the areas where the people of Gaza used to live. They're the parents of the people in Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and the children who are being bombed to smithereens in Gaza. Their parents, their grandparents lived in these areas, but they were expelled by Europeans, by North Americans, by Eastern Europeans, and put into this rotten place called Gaza. But again, this very rotten place has shown itself to be a place where the most heroic and the most dignified resistance has also taken place.
Richard Medhurst, it is ironic, isn't it, as Professor Marandi says, that for all this talk about beheadings, the one group of Islamist fanatics who specialized in beheadings were the ISIS and Al-Qaeda and alphabet soup of fanatic extremism that was supported by the West in their attempt to overthrow the secular government in Damascus. How's that for an irony?
It's a bloody good irony. And I really find this funny because, you know, first of all, we all know this, but it's worth repeating that ISIS would not exist had we not invaded Iraq and created a power vacuum, and then also tried to destroy Syria and created another power vacuum and allowed these groups to thrive. And again, many of these terrorists in both Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and all these this alphabet soup that have been funded by Turkey and Israel openly working with them, by the way. A lot of these terrorists are already known to the security services, which I always find weird because they just always know of them and never pick them up or block them or stop them. But in any case, I find this funny that now they're trying to shove this slogan down people's throats that Hamas is ISIS, right? They're literally saying this, like Hamas is ISIS. No, it's absolutely not. I mean, this is like, I don't know how to, I don't even know what to say. It's so barren and intellectually bankrupt to say that. They don't even have the same political goals or ideology at all. And this thing with the beheadings, I mean, if that's the only, not only is it a lie, but if that's the only characteristic, then why don't we just say like the French Revolution is ISIS, since they cut off heads as well? I mean, this just makes no sense.
Yeah,
so
royal heads. Royal heads. Look, we're running out of time. I want to give Tara Reade the last word. Tara, you're in exile now. I hope you're faring well. And you've written a book about your experience. Tell us, please, in closing, about that.
It's called Left Out When the Truth Doesn't Fit In, and it's out, and an epilogue is coming out in an audiobook. I'm working for RT, and they're really covering this recent conflict, George, very well, trying to give balance. But of course, it's hard to see it because it's been banned in the UK, and RT is very hard to find in the US as well. But we're here, and you can find us on Russia Today, trying to give a pushback on the narratives that everyone's getting to hear. And you made some good points about propaganda, and I just want to put it out there that we need to support people like yourself and Richard, who have these platforms. And of course, for the professor's work, it's so crucial that we have other narratives and other voices that don't get heard, and let them be heard. And I'm very lucky to be in Moscow, Russia. I'm faring very well. I'm surrounded by people that care for me and are keeping me safe, and I'm able to do my work. So thank you for having me.
God bless you, and God bless you all. Remember, there's a mass demonstration at the weekend in London in support of the Palestinian people. It is not yet illegal, and neither are Palestinian flags illegal, whatever Suella Braverman says. As a matter of fact, when James, not so cleverly, Britain's Foreign Secretary, meets with Ambassador Zomlot of the Palestinian embassy in London, he meets him beside the British and Palestinian flags. So it is simply untrue, and no court in Britain will convict someone for merely having a Palestinian flag. So I'm not in Britain, so I won't be able to be there. But if I were, I'd be in London for the Palestinian demonstration. It's not a Hamas demonstration. I'm not a supporter of Hamas. I've been opposed to Hamas even before the years of the Syrian war. I was present in Gaza in 1980 when the Israeli state was deliberately facilitating the birth of Hamas to provide a counterweight to my friend Yasser Arafat and the mainstream PLO, a good example of being careful what you wish for. So I hope that everyone has found this broadcast by No2Nato, No to War, useful. There'll be another one along in 2 weeks at the same time. But I am on air every Sunday and every Wednesday, God willing, with the mother of all talk shows. Since Sunday, and it's only Thursday, now 11.3 million people have watched the output of the mother of all talk shows. And I think that proves that we are not alone. We are not some outliers, but that we speak for a very significant section of public opinion in the world. Thank you for watching. Follow us on social media. See you next time.